At 11:32 on the morning of November 29th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran pressed his jaw against the cold steel of his gun sight and watched death organize itself into formation. He could see them clearly now. A dozen Messerschmitts peeling out of the sun like splinters off a blade, each one angling toward the tail of the Ricky Tikitavi with the practiced patience of hunters who had done this before. Many times before. The aluminum skin around him was already singing, that high, terrible vibration that every tail gunner learned to recognize, the sound of 20-millimeter cannons finding their range. Moran was 19 years old. He was also completely alone. That was the first thing you had to understand about the tail gunner's position, the loneliness of it. The rest of the crew was up there somewhere. They're 40 feet forward through a narrow tube of aluminum and frozen wire. The pilot, the co-pilot, the navigator. 8 other men whose voices he could hear through the interphone, but whose faces he could not see. In the tail there was only Moran, a bicycle-style seat, and 2.50 caliber machine guns pointed at whatever was coming to kill him. The Germans had figured out early that attacking from directly behind a B-17 meant facing only one man. Just one. So that's where they always came from. And that meant the tail gunner was never protecting himself. He was protecting everyone else, buying seconds with his own life so the rest of the crew could make it home. By November of 1943, the mathematics of that arrangement had become savage. The 8th Air Force required crews to complete 25 missions before rotating home. The statistical analysis, cold, bureaucratic, precise, showed the average crew lasted 15. Some bomb groups were losing half their aircraft every single month. 2 months earlier, the raid on Schweinfurt had cost 60 flying fortresses in one afternoon. 600 men dead or captured before dinner. The crews had a name for deep missions into Germany. They called them milk runs to hell. And they said it without irony, because irony required a kind of emotional distance that combat at 24,000 feet did not permit. Eugene Moran had grown up without much distance from anything. Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, a dairy farming community so small that the word quiet doesn't quite cover it. He had spent his boyhood mornings in the barn before the sun came up, his hands learning the rhythm of hard work before his mind had any language for it. And sometimes, when the light was right and the cows were settled, he would stop and look up through the open loft door at the sky, at the silver glint of aircraft passing overhead, impossibly high and impossibly free, and feel something tighten in his chest that he couldn't name. He enlisted the day he turned 18. The Army Air Forces needed gunners, young men with quick reflexes, farm boys who already knew how to lead a moving target, who could hold still under pressure, whose hands didn't shake. Gunnery training sharpened what the farm had already built. He learned to track fast-moving targets while compensating for altitude, wind, and the speed of his own aircraft. He learned to fire in short, disciplined bursts so his barrels wouldn't overheat. He memorized silhouettes, the squared wingtips of the Messerschmitt Bf-109, and the wide radial cowling of the Focke-Wulf 190, until he could identify them at 2,000 yards before they were close enough to kill him. What training could not teach him was the cold. At 24,000 feet over Germany, temperatures dropped to 43 degrees below zero. Frostbite took fingers and toes with no warning, no negotiation. The thin air made every movement feel like working underwater. The oxygen mask fogged and froze. The gun mechanisms froze. The blood in your ears felt like it was trying to find somewhere warmer to be, and still the fighters came. The Ricky Tikitavi had taken off that morning from Snetterton Heath in England as part of the 96th Bomb Group, one of more than 300 bombers the 8th Air Force had dispatched toward Bremen, an industrial port city on the Weser River, ringed with anti-aircraft batteries and fighter bases. They defended with the particular ferocity the Germans reserved for targets they could not afford to lose: shipyards, aircraft factories, submarine pens. The formations had crossed the North Sea in tight defensive boxes, each bomber positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. In theory, the combined firepower of massed B-17s could overwhelm any fighter attack. In practice, a direct flak hit on one aircraft regularly damaged the bombers flying beside it. And Bremen's flak was not theoretical. It was thick and black and everywhere, filling the sky like a weather system made of metal. And as Moran watched from the tail, he saw a B-17 in the formation ahead fold at the wing root and simply cease to be a flyable object. The Ricky Tikitavi reached the target. I released its bombs, 4,000 pounds of high explosives tumbling toward the factories below. Mission accomplished. Now they just had to survive the flight home. Moran pressed his shoulders into the steel chest plate, narrowed his eyes behind the raised goggles, set his jaw, and held his triggers. The Messerschmitts were close enough now that he could see the muzzle flash from their cannons. He didn't look away. If you want to see more of stories like this, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II. Nobody volunteered for the tail position. Not really. You could frame it as patriotism or eagerness or the particular bravado that 18-year-old men manufacture when they don't yet understand what they're volunteering for. But the veterans who had flown even 2 or 3 missions over Germany didn't dress it up. The tail was where the fighters came from. It was where the kills were easiest and the odds were worst. And the man who sat back there on that bicycle seat, knees folded, shoulders pressed into a steel plate, staring backward into the sky. That man was the first thing the Luftwaffe saw when they set up their attack runs. Moran had accepted the assignment without complaint. That was the farm in him. You did the job that needed doing. But understanding what he had accepted required understanding what the 8th Air Force had become by the autumn of 1943. And that understanding was not comfortable. The statistics, when laid out plainly, read less like military accounting and more like a slow verdict being handed down. A crew needed 25 completed missions to earn rotation home. 25 trips across the channel and back, through flak fields and fighter swarms and oxygen-thin air cold enough to kill you through your gloves. The Army had set that number because it sounded achievable. The actual numbers told a different story. Analysis of loss rates showed the average crew completed 15 missions before they were shot down, killed, or scattered across the European countryside. 15. Were filling seats vacated by men who had flown fewer than 10 missions. The arithmetic did not resolve into hope no matter how many times you ran it. The tail gunner's arithmetic was worse. German fighter pilots had developed their attack doctrine through trial and brutal error. A head-on pass against a B-17 formation required nerve and precise timing, but attacking from directly behind, from the 6 o'clock position, straight and level, exposed the attacker to the fire of only one man, one gunner, one pair of .50 calibers between the fighter and a clean shot at the bomber's vulnerable fuselage and tail controls. The Luftwaffe had learned this early. They exploited it systematically. Which meant the tail gunner was not simply defending the rear of the aircraft. He was standing in the doorway that everyone kept trying to kick open, holding it closed with his hands, while the rest of the crew concentrated on the threats coming from every other direction. The position demanded a specific kind of man. Not reckless. Recklessness got you killed faster, and the tail gunner's job required patience as much as nerve. You had to hold fire until the range closed to where your bursts would actually do damage. You had to keep your barrels from overheating. You had to track fast-moving targets in 3 dimensions while your own aircraft was banking and yawing and shuddering from flak. You had to do all of this in temperatures that dropped to 43 degrees below zero, as where the metal of your gun handles could pull the skin from your fingers if you made contact without gloves, and where frostbite moved into exposed flesh not gradually but suddenly, the way a light goes out. Moran had been built for it before he ever knew the job existed. Soldiers' Grove sat in the driftless region of southwestern Wisconsin, the part of the state the glaciers had skipped, leaving behind a landscape of steep ridges and narrow valleys that required a different kind of farming than the flat, mechanized fields to the north. The Moran farm ran dairy cattle, which meant the work never stopped, not for weather, not for holidays, not for the kind of bone tiredness that accumulated across a Wisconsin winter like snow in a fence line. You rose before the light, and you worked until the dark said you were finished. And in between, you learned things that no classroom taught. How to stay focused through exhaustion, how to solve mechanical problems with whatever was in your hands, how to absorb bad news and keep moving, because the animals didn't care about your feelings and neither did the weather. He had watched aircraft from that farm since he was old enough to shade his eyes and look up. They passed overhead in the clear days, silver and remote, and entirely apart from the world he knew. He didn't romanticize flight the way some boys did. He wasn't drawn to the glamour of it. He was drawn to the going, to the idea that a machine could carry a man out of the valley and over the ridge and into something larger. He didn't have words for that feeling when he was 12 or 15 or 17. He just knew it was there, unsteady as the herd coming in for the evening milking. He enlisted in January of 1942, the day he turned 18. The Army Air Forces were expanding at a pace the peacetime military had never imagined, and they needed bodies in specific positions. Positions that required young men who could absorb information quickly, who had good hand-eye coordination, who would not freeze when the situation demanded movement. Gunners. They needed gunners by the thousands. The recruiters were looking for farm boys almost by name. Gunnery school was 8 weeks of relentless instruction. He learned the mechanical architecture of the .50 caliber Browning until he could field strip it blindfolded. He learned deflection shooting, the art of firing not where the target was, but where it was going to be, accounting for the relative speeds of his rounds and the enemy aircraft, accounting for wind and altitude and his own bomber's velocity. He learned the silhouettes of every German fighter in the Luftwaffe inventory. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 with its narrow fuselage and squared wingtips. The Focke-Wulf 190 with its wide, powerful radial engine and blunt nose. He could identify them at 2,000 yards, in poor light, at angles that reduced them to partial shapes against the sky. He graduated near the top of his class. He was assigned to the 96th Bomb Group, stationed at Snetterton Heath in Norfolk. He flew his first missions in the summer of 1943 over France and the Low Countries. Targets that were difficult without being catastrophic, enough to teach him what his training had only approximated. And then the group began flying deep into Germany, and the education changed character entirely. The briefing for the Bremen mission was held before dawn on November 29th. The crews filed into the briefing room in the dark, coffee going cold in their hands, and watched the intelligence officer pull back the curtain on the route map. A groan moved through the room when they saw the red string stretched across the North Sea and deep into northwestern Germany. Bremen. One of the most heavily defended industrial targets in the Reich. Shipyards producing tonnage the German Navy couldn't afford to lose. Aircraft factories. Submarine construction pens where the U-boats that were strangling Allied supply lines were assembled and launched. The flak over Bremen was described in the briefing as intense and accurate. This was the Air Force's way of saying that the anti-aircraft batteries below knew exactly what altitude the B-17S flew at and had pre-registered their guns accordingly. The fighter opposition was expected to be heavy. The escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts, could only accompany the bombers to the Dutch coast. After that, the B-17S would be alone. The Ricky Tikitavi lifted off from Snetterton Heath in the gray pre-dawn and climbed through the English overcast to join the formation assembling above the clouds. More than 300 bombers from multiple groups were converging on the assembly point, forming the defensive boxes that were the 8th Air Force's answer to fighter attack, aircraft packed close enough together that any attacking fighter would fly through dozens of overlapping fields of fire. The theory was sound. The execution was imperfect, always, because weather and mechanical failures and the simple chaos of assembling hundreds of aircraft in close proximity meant the boxes were never as tight as the planners drew them on paper. They crossed the North Sea at altitude. Below, the water was iron gray and featureless. Above, the sky was the particular hard blue that exists only at altitude in winter, cloudless and infinite and hostile in its clarity, because clarity meant visibility, and visibility meant the fighters found you faster. The escort left them at the Dutch coast, waggling wings in a signal that was almost apologetic, and turned back toward England. Moran watched them go from the tail position and felt the familiar recalibration. The psychological shift that happened every time the last friendly fighter disappeared from view, and the crew was left with nothing between them and the Luftwaffe except altitude and their own guns. The first fighters made contact over the Zuider Zee. They came in from the high 12 o'clock position initially, head-on passes against the lead formation, trying to scatter the defensive boxes and create gaps they could exploit on subsequent passes. Moran could hear the interphone erupting, the waist gunners calling out positions, the top turret tracking, the ball turret gunner below the aircraft calling vectors. He held his own fire, watching his sector, at keeping discipline. The tail was quiet for the first pass. The fighters knew better than to present themselves to the tail gunner when the formation was still intact and the overlapping fire was at maximum effectiveness. They were patient. They had time. The flak opened up as the formations crossed into German airspace proper. Moran had seen flak before, but Bremen's batteries were operating at a different level. The black bursts were everywhere, not scattered but dense, filling the air in the corridor the bombers were forced to fly through because the bomb run required straight and level flight. No evasive maneuvering, the aircraft locked onto the target for the bombardier regardless of what was coming up from below. Shrapnel cracked against the fuselage of the Ricky Tikitavi, small sounds individual like someone throwing gravel. And then a heavier impact that Moran felt through his seat, metal tearing somewhere forward of his position. He heard the pilot's voice on the interphone. Engine number 2 was losing oil pressure. They were feathering the prop. A B-17 could fly on 3 engines. It could hold formation, theoretically, if the conditions were right and the damage was limited to 1 power plant. But the math shifted immediately and in one direction only. 3 engines meant reduced airspeed. Reduced airspeed meant falling behind the formation. Falling behind the formation meant losing the overlapping fields of fire that made the defensive box survivable. It meant becoming a straggler. And stragglers over Germany in November of 1943 had a life expectancy that could be measured in minutes. The Ricky Tikitavi began to fall back. That the German fighters found them within 4 minutes of the formation pulling away. Not the probing, tentative attacks of a unit testing defenses. These were coordinated, purposeful, a swarm of Messerschmitt 109s that had been watching the formation, identifying the wounded aircraft, waiting for it to separate the way wolves wait for a deer to begin to limp. They came in pairs, one drawing fire while the other lined up a shot, working in rotation, each pass tightening as they refined the geometry of the attack. Moran was firing constantly now, short bursts, disciplined, tracking the fighters through their approach angles and breaking off when they dove below his line of fire and picking up the next one already beginning its run. The gun handles were vibrating hard enough to travel up his forearms. Spent brass casings were rattling around the tail compartment floor. The smell of cordite was so thick it cut through the oxygen mask. A 20-millimeter round came through the fuselage 6 inches from his right shoulder and exited through the skin on the other side without detonating. He registered it, a hole, daylight, cold air screaming through, and moved his sight onto the fighter that had fired it and held the trigger down until the Messerschmitt rolled away trailing smoke. Then the world ended. It didn't feel like an explosion exactly. The sensation that reached Moran was less a sound than a physical event, a concussive restructuring of the space around him, as if the aircraft had simply decided to stop being a single object. The fuselage buckled ahead of the tail section. He heard metal shrieking along metal, but the Ricky Tikitavi. All of it that was forward of his position, all 9 of his crewmates, the cockpit, the wings, the engines, the bombs already dropped, and the bomb bay already empty. The entire aircraft separated from him as if pulled away by something enormous and invisible. And then there was silence. Almost silence. Wind and the thin whistle of air moving through the jagged, torn aluminum edges that now framed every direction around him. The tail section was spinning slowly, the stabilizers catching air at strange angles, and through the torn-open rear of what had been his aircraft, Eugene Moran could see the German countryside 4 miles below him, tilting and rotating as he fell toward it. He reached for his parachute. The canvas was shredded. Cannon fire, sometime during the last several minutes, had reduced it to ribbons. He registered this fact with a clarity that he would describe years later as almost peaceful, the way extreme shock sometimes produces a strange, suspended calm before the reality arrives. There was no parachute. There was no aircraft. There were no crewmates. There was only the severed tail section spinning through 24,000 feet of German winter sky, and Moran inside it, and the ground coming up at 100 feet per second. He looked at his guns. They were still mounted, still fed, still pointed at the sky he was falling through. And somewhere above him, through the tumbling chaos of his descent, a Messerschmitt was curving around to make another pass at what was left of the Ricky Tikitavi. Moran gripped the handles, steadied his breathing, and put his eye back to the sight. The Messerschmitt came in from the high left, in angling down in a shallow dive, the pilot probably assuming the tail section was dead weight. Wreckage, not a threat. Something to strafe on the way past for the satisfaction of finishing it. He would have seen the spinning aluminum debris, the torn stabilizers, the ugly tumbling geometry of a destroyed aircraft component falling through clear air. He would not have expected the muzzle flash. Moran fired first. He had perhaps 3 seconds of clean tracking as the fighter crossed his sight line, and he used all 3. The burst walked up the Messerschmitt's fuselage from the engine cowling toward the cockpit, and the fighter broke hard left and dove away, trailing a thin white stream of coolant or smoke. He couldn't tell which. Couldn't tell if it was a kill or a wound, and it didn't matter. That's because another one was already setting up behind it. What he had discovered in those first seconds of freefall was that the tail section was not falling the way a stone falls. It was doing something stranger and, in the most literal sense of the word, more miraculous. The horizontal stabilizers, the small wing-like surfaces at the very rear of the fuselage designed to keep the aircraft level in controlled flight, were catching air. Not efficiently. Not in any way an aeronautical engineer would have designed or predicted, but the physics of the thing, the sheer dumb accident of how the fuselage had broken and how the stabilizers were now oriented relative to the airflow, was producing something between a spin and a glide. The descent was fast, catastrophically fast by any civilian standard, but it was not the uncontrolled vertical plummet it should have been. The wreckage was, against all reason, behaving like a crude and violent flying machine. Moran did not know this in any analytical sense. He knew it the way a farmer knows weather, through the body, through instinct, through the evidence of what he could feel. The spin had a rhythm to it. The air was hitting him from a consistent direction. He was falling, yes, but he was falling in a way that had pattern to it, and pattern meant something he could work with. So he worked. 2 more fighters made passes during the descent. The German pilots were curious at first, then apparently unwilling to press the attack against a man who kept shooting back from a piece of wreckage in freefall. He going to hit the ground in a matter of going to hit the ground in a matter of minutes regardless, and the man inside it was either going to die on impact or he wasn't. And either way, the threat would resolve itself without further expenditure of ammunition. They broke off and climbed back toward the remaining bombers. Moran kept his hands on the triggers and watched them go. Then he watched the ground come up. The German countryside below had resolved from an abstract patchwork of fields and forests into individual trees, individual roads, the particular geometry of a specific piece of earth that was going to be the last thing he ever saw or wasn't. A bleeding off speed in their rough and bleeding off speed in their rough and accidental way. He had no way to steer, no way to prepare beyond bracing himself against the gun mounts, making his body as compact as he could, and accepting what was coming with whatever remained of his nerve. The trees hit him like a wall. He was conscious when the German soldiers found him, which should not have been possible. The tail section had come down through the upper canopy of the pine forest, the branches shredding its remaining speed in a series of violent impacts before it struck the ground at an angle that was survivable in the most brutal and technical application of that word. Survivable meant alive. It did not mean whole. And both of Moran's arms were shattered, the right one in multiple places from cannon fragments, the left from the impact itself. His skull had been fractured, and in one place the bone had been driven inward far enough that brain matter was visible beneath it. He had shrapnel in his back, his legs, his side. He had been at 43 degrees below zero for hours, and his core temperature was dropping. The Wehrmacht soldiers who reached him were not cruel. They were, by most accounts, visibly shaken. They had been sent to collect wreckage and possibly a body, and instead they found a 19-year-old boy from Wisconsin still alive in the ruins of a machine that had fallen 4 miles from the sky. They moved him with rough care onto a stretcher and carried him to a vehicle, and the vehicle took him to a German military hospital. And the doctors there looked at him and made the calculation that military medicine in 1943 was accustomed to making under pressure. Who was worth the resources and who was not? Moran's injuries were catastrophic. His arms would require extensive surgery. His skull required immediate intervention that the facility was ill-equipped to provide. His chances of surviving the night, let alone the week, were poor enough that the decision was made to move him to a prisoner of war processing facility rather than commit a surgical team to a man unlikely to leave the table. They laid him on a concrete floor and left him. What happened next was the second miracle of that day, smaller in spectacle than the first, but no less improbable in its way. The facility held prisoners from across occupied Europe, laborers, captured soldiers, and men the Reich had decided were more useful alive than dead, but not worth treating as human beings. Among them were 2 Serbian physicians, themselves prisoners, who had been permitted to practice a limited form of medicine on the prisoner population because it was cheaper than replacing workers who died of preventable causes. They found Moran on the floor. What they saw was a young man with injuries that should have killed him twice, once in the air, once on the ground, who was still breathing with a stubbornness that appeared to be a fundamental characteristic of his nature. The Serbian doctors had crude instruments, almost no anesthesia, and no authority to commandeer German medical supplies for an American prisoner. What they had was training, improvisation, and apparently a shared conviction that a man who had survived what this one had survived deserved the chance to keep doing it. The surgery lasted 7 hours. Later accounts describe the procedure in terms that make the word surgery seem generous. More accurate would be salvage, a systematic effort to remove metal, stabilize bone, relieve pressure on the brain, and close wounds that had been open long enough to begin their own lethal processes. Moran was conscious for portions of it. The anesthesia available was inadequate for the scope of what they were doing, and there were intervals where he could feel what was happening and could do nothing about it except remain still, which he did, because the farm had built in him the capacity to absorb pain without broadcasting it. When it was over, the Serbian doctors told the German guards that the American might live. The Germans received this information with apparent indifference. Moran lived. Recovery, such as it was, happened inside the prisoner of war system. a network of camps and transit facilities that processed Allied airmen with bureaucratic thoroughness and minimal regard for their physical condition. Moran's arms healed imperfectly, the bones knitting in ways that would restrict his movement for the rest of his life. The skull injury left him with headaches that arrived without warning and stayed for days. He was moved between facilities as the Allied advance in the west began pressing the German defensive lines, and each move meant less food, less shelter, and less of everything that the human body requires to repair itself. By the winter of 1944 into 1945, the situation inside the camp system had deteriorated to the edge of collapse. The German military was pulling back across a shrinking front, and the camps in the east were suddenly uncomfortably close to the advancing Soviet armies. The decision was made to move the prisoners west, on foot, in January. The march that the survivors would later call the Black March began in temperatures that regularly dropped to 25 degrees below zero. The column stretched for miles, thousands of Allied prisoners in various states of malnutrition and injury, guarded by Wehrmacht soldiers who were themselves exhausted and increasingly aware that the war they were guarding these men for was already decided. The order regarding prisoners who could not maintain pace was not written down anywhere that has been preserved. It didn't need to be. Not everyone in the column understood it. Moran walked. He had arrived at the camp weighing somewhere near his pre-war farm weight. He began the march weighing considerably less than that, his body having converted itself to fuel during months of inadequate rations. He walked on frost-bitten feet through German snow for 600 miles, covering the distance over weeks that blurred together into a single sustained act of refusal. Refusal to fall behind. Refusal to give the guards the occasion to apply the unwritten order that everyone understood. Men died around him. Men he had spoken with, eaten with, kept alive in small ways through the long months in camp. They fell out of the column and did not rejoin it, and the march absorbed their absence and continued. Moran put one foot in front of the other with the same quiet stubbornness he had carried into the tail section of the Ricky Tikitavi 14 months earlier. Not heroically, not dramatically, but with the deep, inarticulate refusal to stop that some people are simply built with, the way some ground is simply harder than other ground. Liberation came on April 26, 1945. American ground forces reached the column, and the guards, doing their own arithmetic about what the next several weeks were going to look like for them personally, did not resist. The war in Europe would end 2 weeks later. Eugene Moran was 21 years old. He weighed 93 pounds. He went home to Soldiers Grove. He married. He worked. He did not talk about Bremen or the fall or the floor of the German facility where the Serbian doctors had found him, or the 700 miles of snow. The people of Soldiers Grove understood, in the way that small communities understood things about their own, that Moran had been through something, and that asking about it directly was not the right approach. So they didn't ask, and he didn't offer, and the years moved over the whole episode like water over stone, slowly smoothing the surface without touching what was underneath. He farmed. He raised a family. He watched the dairy operation change across the decades, the machinery getting larger, the methods getting more efficient, the valley staying the way valleys stay in the driftless region, steep and particular and resistant to the kind of change that flattens other places. He grew old in the landscape that had made him. He outlived most of the men he had been imprisoned with, and he outlived most of the men he had trained with. He outlived, by a very long margin, the statistical expectations that the 8th Air Force's actuaries had assigned to tail gunners flying over Germany in the autumn of 1943. He did not speak publicly about any of it for nearly 60 years. When he finally did, when the combination of age and the approach of the 60th anniversary of the war loosened something that decades of silence had held in place, what emerged was not the dramatic account of a man processing trauma. It was quieter than that, and more precise. He remembered specific things with the clarity that extreme experience burns into memory. The sound of the fuselage separating, the rhythm of the stabilizers catching air, the faces of the Serbian doctors working above him in a room where everything was wrong and inadequate and insufficient, and how they had worked anyway. He remembered the cold. He said the cold was the thing that stayed with him longest, the physical memory of it outlasting everything else, waking him sometimes in the Wisconsin winters of his later life with the particular quality of chill that only exists at altitude, at 24,000 feet, in November, when you are 19 years old and absolutely alone, and everything that should save you has already been taken away. The town of Soldiers Grove named a street after him before he died. It was a modest honor, the kind that small communities extend to their own. A sign on a road that most people drove past without reading, in a valley that the larger world had no particular reason to know about. Moran, by all accounts, was satisfied with this. He had not survived because he wanted recognition. He had survived because stopping was not something he knew how to do. He had learned that in the barn, before the sun came up, before the war, before the sky over Bremen opened up beneath him and the laws of physics agreed, just this once, to look the other way. If you want to see more of stories like this, please hit the like button and subscribe. It helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II and comment where you're watching from.